This is going to be the first in a series of videos about the Amiga, which was a computer. It was the first computer I owned, or my family owned more accurately, and it was very special to me. It's hard nowadays to think of a computer as being special. The Amiga was not a PC, it was a rival to the PC, and it was very different and had a very different culture around it, and had, it was much more powerful than the PC, and it had a very different type of people using it and a different type of people making software for it. Obviously, well, not obviously, but people made a lot of games for the Amiga, and I just got my skin rash on them, and the Amiga was very important to me because I think about a group of, in the end, about 10 of my friends all had Amigas, so we had that shared experience, and the Amiga lasted a long time. It lasted many years, and it was a very exciting computer. Again, it's difficult to think of computers being exciting. Computers now are so dull, so useless. The software is basically just junk, and computers and computer software are really made by idiots, for idiots, generally speaking. They've really lost their way, and it's a tragedy. But anyway, this is not about that. This is about the Amiga and why it was so wonderful. So I remember a couple of friends had Amigas before anyone else. My friend Michael, I think, was the first person, or it was definitely the first person I knew who had Amiga. And he was probably the first person whose Amiga I used a lot. I'd go to his house at weekends or after school, and we'd play lots of games together. And he had lots of other computers around his house. He had older computers like the VIC-20, the ZX Spectrum, probably a BBC Micro. His dad was a computer teacher at school, I think, so there were a lot of computers around the house. But we ignored all those computers because the Amiga was a generation beyond that and so much more powerful. But because of his father's connections, they were able to get a lot of copied software, and that was one of the big reasons to get an Amiga, not just buy a games console, which other people were getting at the time. You could get, I think it was probably at the time of the 8-bit games consoles, so things like, in England it would have been the Sega Master System 2 and the NES, Nintendo Entertainment System. It was probably a couple of years before those 16-bit consoles, the Super NES and the Sega Mega Drive came out, and definitely before 16-bit handhelds like the Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear. So it was a very, very exciting time, and I felt I really needed an Amiga because I just saw this incredible software with amazing graphics and fantastic sound. And I remember Michael had plugged his Amiga into an amplifier with a huge speaker under the desk, like a single giant sort of subwoofer speaker or whatever. So when we were playing games and there were explosions, like our legs would shake. And then anyway, yeah, a bunch of us started to get Amigas, and I can still remember when it first arrived. We had a German exchange student, like a homestay student, staying with us who was studying English in probably at the local university, one of the English schools. So he was living with us, and he had an Amiga at home, so he helped me set it up. And I remember it came with a few games, and it came with the operating system software, which is called Amiga Workbench, and a bunch of manuals. And it came with a tutorial disc that taught you how to use a mouse and how to click on things, because it was my first time to use a mouse. And I'll do other videos later about games, but the way the Amiga was sold in England was basically, although it was a serious computer, unfortunately it was sold through toy shops generally, or through the home through the shopping catalogue stores like Argos. So you'd get an Amiga. It cost at that time it cost £400 and didn't come with a monitor. You hooked it up to your TV. So a lot of money for a computer when consoles were about half the price. The difference being, however, that when I got my Amiga, I think it came with 5 bits of software as standard. So it came with a very, very powerful paint program called Deluxe Paint 2. It came with some games. One was Shadow of the Beast 2, one was Back to the Future 2, one was Days of Thunder, and one was Nightbreed. So this was called the Screen Gems Pack because they were film related, with the exception of Shadow of the Beast 2. Shadow of the Beast 2 was hugely influential on me. I took my name, Karamoon is the land where Shadow of the Beast 2 is set. So it's the name I took when I first had to make an email address probably when I was at sixth form doing my A-levels. And it's been my name ever since. So actually in Japan more people probably know me as Karamoon than as Matthew. But anyway, as I said, I'll make some videos about Amiga games later because they really were works of art. But just, again, it's hard to imagine what those games were like because now games are made with teams of 30, 40, 50 people. And a lot of those people are working on a whole bunch of games at once, and it's just their job. And there's no creativity there. They're just a graphics person or a sound person. And if they're a graphics person, they don't do the graphics for the whole game. They do a tiny little part of it. So they might be the person who just does the vehicles in the game, or just does the main character of the game, or just does the lighting for the game. And again, with the sound, there'll be someone who just does the sound effects, or even just does a certain type of sound effect. There'll be other people who just do the music. But when the Amiga was around, games could still be made by one single person, and usually teams of, I think, under 10. So you'd often have, the classic team would be 2 people, like a designer and a coder, so a designer and a programmer. And the designer would probably do the graphics and the sound as well, which is, again, you wouldn't even imagine that kind of thing now. So that meant the games were far more creative, far more care went into them, and they had a vision of, because far fewer people were making them, they weren't sort of games by committee. So I'm going to talk about that in some of the games that were very special to me. I'll talk about in other videos, but I'm just hoping that if you owned an Amiga, you could either make a video or at least just put down some on the YouTube comments, put down anything you remember, any questions you had. One of the things I remember most about the Amiga, of course, was it was using a floppy disk. There was no hard disk, and Commodore, the company that made Amiga, they made a whole series of very bad design decisions. I think maybe some of those decisions were justified at the time, but in retrospect we can say they were actually wrong because ultimately the Amiga has failed. It's not really around now, except in very strange forms. But one of the design decisions was to put a cheaper floppy disk drive in, so it had what's called a double-sided, double-density drive, which meant each disk held 720K, whereas the PCs that were around at the time, they were using a double-sided high-density drive, which held essentially double 1.44 megs, 1.4 megs, something like that. So that meant if you had a floppy-based PC, you would do essentially half the disk swapping. It would have just made such a difference to have that more expensive drive. But anyway, there were many mistakes they made. The actual Amiga itself was incredible, and the people that made it were very different from people involved in PCs. They were far more counterculture people, far more creative, far more exciting people. And this was reflected in the software and things like it was reflected in the magazines. I would sometimes get Amiga magazines. There were some serious magazines like Amiga Format or Amiga Shopper or Amiga Youth International, and then there were ones that just focused on games like Amiga Action and Amiga Power. I really liked Amiga Action for games because the magazine had a very young feel to it. It was sort of made by very normal people. Amiga Power I never really got into. I wish I had done now, because it had a very deep culture I've since found out as an adult. I think I was very lucky with the Amiga because, as I said, about 10 of us all had Amigas, and my friend Michael, his father was sort of knew about computers, so that helped a lot. And I've had two friends who were very close friends, and their brothers, Andrew and James, and their father knew a lot about computers as well. Before the Amiga, they had a hilarious Welsh computer called the Dragon 32 that was made in Cardiff to try and jumpstart the Welsh economy. That ended up as a temperature controller for a kiln in their garage for baking pots, firing pots. But they had an Amiga, and their father knew how to make software on the Amiga using a programming language called Amos. So he encouraged us, and the two brothers, Andrew and James, encouraged me to program with Amos, and it was incredible. Amos was a very sophisticated language. It was based on BASIC, the Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, which is a very simple English-like language for beginners, as the name suggests. But Amos was far more powerful than that. It had, it could, for example, you could poke and peek into the memory directly. It had very complicated and sophisticated procedures handling, so you could have code that was much easier to read than BASIC. BASIC gets very messy when you have a lot of BASIC code with all the subroutines. Amos was much more powerful, and I think probably the first bit of software I ever bought was the professional version of Amos, which I think was £70. It was a huge amount of money to spend at that time. And again, bearing in mind essentially all my games were copied. So I didn't think of software as being something that you really paid money for, but to get Amos Professional with it was probably the only way I could get it, and I needed the manuals anyway. Another friend also had an Amiga and was a year older than me, and we started doing Amos programming together, trying to make games and having a lot of fun. We made platform game called Larry in the Sky with Diamonds, but our main project was a side-scrolling game, a fighting game called Vendetta, which was epic. I mean, we put so much time into that, and we struggled so much because neither of us really knew what we were doing. And the biggest mistake I made with the Amiga was not learning enough. I played around with it a lot, but I should have gone and found books. That's sort of one of my regrets, really, is that one of my few regrets. You shouldn't have regrets in life, but I do regret not reading those magazines more carefully and going and looking for the books and going to the library and looking for books on computing. Probably wouldn't have found many Amiga books in the library, but I could have ordered them from the library. I should have put a much more effort into learning about the fundamentals and the deep points of making software with Amiga. So anyway, this is my first Amiga Memories video. There's going to be a whole load more, probably at least another couple. Please leave a comment, and please donate to my cancer fund if you can. If you've enjoyed this, www.matthewdons.org. Thank you very much.